The Black Death, also known as the bubonic plague, was one of the most catastrophic pandemics in human history, sweeping through Europe in the mid-14th century and forever changing the course of the Middle Ages. It is a subject often glossed over as a grim footnote in history books or portrayed dramatically in films, but its impact was both complex and far-reaching. This video will gently unravel the layers of this devastating event and explore how it reshaped society in ways that still echo through time. The central theme of this discussion revolves around how the plague fundamentally altered the economic, social, religious, and cultural structures of medieval Europe, paving the way for the eventual emergence of the modern world. To understand the significance of the Black Death, we first need to grasp the context of Europe before the plague's arrival. The Middle Ages, often referred to as the Dark Ages, was a time characterized by feudalism, rigid class hierarchies, and widespread superstition. Life was precarious and often brutal, with limited medical knowledge, frequent wars, and famine affecting many regions. The population of Europe had been steadily growing for centuries, but living conditions were generally harsh, and the average lifespan was short. In the early 1300s, Europe was a patchwork of kingdoms and city-states, governed by monarchs, nobles, and the powerful church. Agriculture was the mainstay of the economy, with most people working as peasants on land owned by the nobility. Trade existed, but was not yet fully developed, and the vast majority of people lived in rural areas, isolated and vulnerable. The plague itself likely originated in Central Asia or China, carried westward along the trade routes that connected the East with the West. It arrived in Europe in 1347, brought by merchant ships docking in ports such as Messina in Sicily. From there, it spread rapidly across the continent, carried by fleas living on black rats that thrived in the unsanitary conditions of medieval towns. The symptoms of the plague were horrifying: painful swellings called buboes, high fevers, vomiting, and death often within days. People were terrified, and the disease's swift spread led to widespread panic. Entire villages and towns were decimated, with death tolls sometimes reaching as high as 50% to 60% of the population. The immediate effects of the Black Death were staggering. With so many people dead, fields went untended, towns were abandoned, and the usual rhythms of life were disrupted. Economies collapsed as labor shortages drove wages up, but also caused food production. The plague also had a profound impact on religion and culture. The Church, which had been the center of medieval life, struggled to explain why God would allow such suffering. This led some to question the Church's authority and teachings, sowing seeds of doubt that would later contribute to movements like the Reformation. At the same time, there was a rise in superstition and scapegoating, with certain groups, such as Jewish communities, unjustly blamed and persecuted. Beyond religion and economy, the Black Death influenced art, literature, and philosophy. Themes of death and mortality became prominent in the works of the time, reflecting society's attempt to come to terms with the trauma. The famous Dance of Death motif appeared in paintings and plays, symbolizing the universality of death, affecting all regardless of status. The long-term consequences of the plague were complex and multifaceted. While it caused unimaginable suffering, it also set in motion changes that helped break down medieval structures and paved the way for the Renaissance and the modern era. Population declines led to technological innovations and shifts in land use, and the disruption of old hierarchies opened up new opportunities for social mobility. In short, the Black Death was not just a tragedy, but a turning point in European history. Understanding this helps us appreciate the resilience of human societies and the unpredictable ways in which disaster can reshape the world. As we move deeper into the story of how the Black Death changed the Middle Ages forever, it's important to understand the profound economic consequences that followed in its wake. The plague's impact on Europe's economy was swift and dramatic, and it set off a chain reaction that reshaped nearly every aspect of daily life. Before the plague, Europe's economy was primarily agrarian and feudal. Most people were peasants bound to the land, working under lords in exchange for protection and a small portion of the crops they grew. The population was growing steadily, which meant more mouths to feed, but also more laborers to work the fields. Landowners relied heavily on this large workforce to maintain their estates and produce enough food to support the population and generate income. However, when the plague swept across Europe, it decimated this labor force almost overnight. Historians estimate that between 1/3 and 1/2 of Europe's population died within a few years of the outbreak. In some areas, the toll was even higher. This sudden loss of life meant that there simply weren't enough people left to work the land, to build, to trade, or to perform the many tasks that kept medieval society functioning. This labor shortage had immediate and far-reaching consequences. For one, peasants and workers found themselves in a position of newfound power. With so few people able to work, landowners had to compete for labor. This competition meant wages began to rise, and peasants could demand better working conditions or leave their feudal obligations to seek better opportunities elsewhere. The rigid social order that had defined the Middle Ages began to loosen, as the balance of power shifted from the nobles to the common people. Many peasants took advantage of this shift to renegotiate the terms of their labor. Some moved to towns and cities where opportunities for paid work were more plentiful. This migration contributed to the growth of urban centers and the gradual decline of the purely feudal countryside. Cities became hubs of commerce and innovation, laying the groundwork for the rise of the merchant class and early capitalism. Landowners, meanwhile, found themselves squeezed by these changes. With fewer tenants to work their lands and increasing demands for higher wages, many struggled to maintain their estates. Some were forced to convert arable land to pasture for sheep, which required less labor and met the growing demand for wool in Europe. This shift helped stimulate the textile industry and trade, but also contributed to social tensions as peasants lost access to common lands they had traditionally used for farming or grazing. The government and ruling classes attempted to stem these changes by issuing laws like the English Statute of Labourers in 1351, which sought to freeze wages and restrict workers from moving freely. However, enforcement was difficult, and over time, these laws became less effective. The social and economic upheaval triggered by the plague was simply too great to reverse. Beyond labor and agriculture, the plague disrupted trade networks across Europe. Ports and trading cities saw dramatic drops in population and activity. Merchants faced new challenges in transporting goods safely as fear of infections spread. However, these disruptions also encouraged innovation and diversification. Some regions began to specialize in different products or trade routes, adapting to the new realities. The scarcity of labor also encouraged technological innovation. With fewer workers available, there was a push to develop tools and machinery that could reduce the need for human labor. For example, improvements in watermills and windmills increased efficiency in grinding grain, while new agricultural techniques helped increase yields despite the reduced workforce. The economic consequences of the Black Death were thus a complex mixture of destruction and transformation. While many traditional systems and ways of life were shattered, the crisis also accelerated change and modernization. It destabilized the medieval feudal economy and opened the door for new social and economic structures that would come to define Europe in the centuries ahead. In addition, the reduction in population meant that there was more land and resources available per capita. This improved the standard of living for many survivors who enjoyed better access to food and land. Though the plague caused unimaginable suffering, its aftermath saw the beginning of a gradual rise in prosperity for some groups within European society. The ripple effects of these economic shifts would extend far beyond the Middle Ages. The growing power of the merchant class, the decline of serfdom, and the rise of wage labor all contributed to the eventual emergence of modern capitalism. The transformation of European economies following the plague laid important foundations for the Renaissance, the Age of Exploration, and the Industrial Revolution. In the next part, we will explore how these economic changes intertwined with profound social and cultural transformations, reshaping the way people lived, thought, and related to one another. As we continue exploring how the plague changed the Middle Ages forever, it's important to delve into the profound social upheaval and cultural transformations that unfolded in the wake of the Black Death. The dramatic loss of life and disruption to everyday life forced medieval society to rethink many of its long-held beliefs and social structures. One of the most immediate social effects of the plague was the breakdown of traditional communities. Entire villages were wiped out or severely depopulated, leading to abandoned homes, empty churches, and neglected fields. For survivors, this meant a sudden loss of neighbors, family members, and community ties that had once provided stability and support. With so many deaths occurring so quickly, the normal rituals surrounding death and mourning were often impossible to perform. The sheer scale of mortality overwhelmed churches and clergy, many of whom themselves succumbed to the disease. Burial practices were hastened and mass graves became common. This breakdown of customary rites contributed to a deep sense of fear, uncertainty, and grief that permeated medieval life. At the same time, the drastic population decline altered social dynamics profoundly. Peasants and laborers found themselves in greater demand, giving them new leverage to demand better wages, working conditions, and even legal rights. The centuries-old system of serfdom, which had bound peasants to the land and their lords, began to erode as many serfs left their manors in search of better opportunities in towns and cities. This social mobility was both liberating and unsettling. For the lower classes, it offered hope and the chance to improve their circumstances. For the nobility and ruling elites, it represented a loss of control and authority. Many landowners resisted these changes, sometimes violently, leading to social unrest and peasant revolts in various parts of Europe, such as the famous English Peasants' Revolt of 1381. The plague also had a profound psychological and cultural impact. The widespread death and suffering led many people to question the nature of life, death, and the divine. The Church, which had long been the center of spiritual and social life, struggled to provide comfort and answers. Some people turned away from traditional religious practices, while others became more devout or joined new religious movements. Fear and superstition flourished in this environment. People searched for explanations for the catastrophe, often blaming marginalized groups such as Jewish communities, foreigners, or those seen as outsiders. This scapegoating led to horrific persecutions and massacres, adding further tragedy to the period. Culturally, the Black Death influenced art, literature, and philosophy in powerful ways. The ever-present reality of death became a central theme in works of the time. The Danse Macabre, or Dance of Death, for instance, became a popular motif in paintings, manuscripts, and plays, symbolizing the universality of death and reminding all that no one, regardless of status, could escape it. Writers and thinkers began to explore themes of mortality, the fragility of life, and the afterlife more deeply. This cultural shift helped prepare the way for the Renaissance, a period that emphasized human experience, individuality, and a renewed interest in classical knowledge. In everyday life, people adapted their habits and behaviors to cope with the new realities. Towns developed better sanitation measures, some of which laid the groundwork for public health practices. The fear of contagion also led to changes in social interaction, such as quarantine practices. Words like quarantine itself, derived from the Italian 40 giorni, meaning 40 days, originated during this period as a way to isolate ships and travelers suspected of carrying the plague. The changes in population also affected family structures and gender roles. With many men dead, women often took on new responsibilities, managing estates, businesses, and farms. This shift gave women a somewhat stronger position in certain contexts, although medieval society remained largely patriarchal. Education and intellectual life were not immune to the plague's impact. Universities and schools faced closures or reduced attendance, as both students and teachers succumbed to the disease. However, the devastation also led to new questioning of established knowledge and traditions, fueling intellectual movements that challenged medieval scholasticism. In summary, the social upheaval and cultural transformations that followed the Black Death were profound and far-reaching. They disrupted centuries-old structures, sowed seeds of new ideas and practices, and shaped the course of European history in ways that lasted well beyond the Middle Ages. In the next part, we will examine how the plague affected religion and spirituality in greater depth, including the challenges it posed to the Church and the religious movements that emerged in response. Continuing our exploration of how the plague changed the Middle Ages forever, we now turn to one of the most significant and complex aspects of this transformation: the impact on religion and spirituality. The Black Death not only devastated populations and economies, but also deeply shook the spiritual foundations of medieval Europe. Before the plague, the Church was the central institution in people's lives. It provided spiritual guidance, social services, education, and governance. The medieval worldview was heavily shaped by Christian teachings, which offered explanations for suffering, death, and the afterlife. The Church was seen as a mediator between God and humanity, and its rituals and sacraments were essential for salvation. However, the scale and speed of death caused by the plague raised difficult questions that challenged the authority and credibility of the Church. The clergy, who were supposed to comfort the sick and provide last rites, were themselves victims of the disease in large numbers. This loss of religious leaders left many communities spiritually adrift. Moreover, the Church's inability to stop or explain the plague led many people to doubt its power and teachings. Some believed the plague was a punishment from God for humanity's sins, while others questioned why a benevolent deity would allow such suffering. This spiritual crisis undermined faith and led to a crisis of authority for the Church. In some cases, this doubt manifested in extreme responses. Flagellant movements arose in many parts of Europe, where groups of people traveled from town to town, publicly whipping themselves to atone for the sins they believed had caused the plague. These movements were often condemned by Church authorities, but reflected widespread fear and desperation. The plague also fueled persecution against groups scapegoated as responsible for the catastrophe. Jewish communities in particular were falsely accused of poisoning wells or causing the plague through nefarious means. This led to violent pogroms, expulsions, and massacres in many regions, adding a tragic human cost to the already devastating epidemic. At the same time, some individuals and groups turned toward mysticism and personal spirituality. The crisis inspired new religious movements that emphasized direct experience of the divine, inner purity, and reform of church practices. These movements often laid the groundwork for later calls for reform and renewal in European Christianity. The clergy themselves were not immune to change. The shortage of priests forced the church to ordain less educated or less experienced individuals, sometimes leading to a decline in the quality of religious leadership. This, combined with widespread corruption and abuses within the church, fueled dissatisfaction among the laity. The combination of spiritual uncertainty, social upheaval, and institutional weaknesses planted seeds that would eventually lead to major religious transformations, including the Protestant Reformation in the 16th century. Despite the crisis, the Church also responded in significant ways. Efforts were made to rebuild communities, provide care for the sick and poor, and restore faith. New religious art and architecture emerged, often reflecting themes of mortality and salvation. Pilgrimages and the veneration of saints saw renewed interest as people sought protection and hope. The impact of the plague on religion also had a lasting influence on European culture and thought. It contributed to a more somber and reflective tone in art and literature, as well as a growing emphasis on individual responsibility and the transient nature of life. In summary, the Black Death profoundly affected religious life in medieval Europe by shaking faith, challenging the Church's authority, and inspiring new forms of spirituality and reform. This spiritual turmoil was a critical part of the broader social and cultural transformations that marked the end of the Middle Ages. In the next part, we will explore how the plague influenced the arts, literature, and philosophy, further shaping the course of European history. As we continue our journey through the lasting effects of the Black Death on the Middle Ages, we now turn our attention to its impact on the arts, literature, and philosophy. The plague's profound disruption to society and its pervasive presence of death deeply influenced how people expressed themselves and sought to understand the world. Before the plague, medieval art and literature were largely focused on religious themes, serving primarily as tools for educating the largely illiterate population about Christian doctrine and morality. Art was dominated by church commissions, illustrating biblical scenes, saints, and the glory of heaven. However, the arrival of the Black Death introduced a new and darker reality into the cultural consciousness. The omnipresence of death and suffering began to change how artists, writers, and thinkers approached their work. One of the most notable artistic themes to emerge in the wake of the plague was the Danse Macabre, or Dance of Death. This motif depicted skeletons, or personifications of death, leading people from all walks of life, kings, peasants, clergy, into a dance toward the grave. It was a powerful visual reminder of death's inevitability and impartiality, emphasizing that no one, regardless of status or wealth, could escape mortality. These images appeared in murals, woodcuts, and illuminated manuscripts, often displayed in churches or public spaces where they could serve as moral lessons to the living. The Dance of Death was a form of memento mori, reminding people to reflect on their own lives, prepare their souls, and live virtuously. Literature, too, took on new tones and subjects. Writers began to explore themes of mortality, human suffering, and the fragility of existence with greater depth and emotional complexity. The Black Death's trauma inspired works that combined religious reflection with a stark awareness of death's power. For example, Giovanni Boccaccio's The Decameron, written shortly after the plague swept through Europe, uses a framing story of young people fleeing the city to escape the disease. The tales they tell range from tragic to comic, but the backdrop of the plague adds a poignant awareness of life's unpredictability and the desire to find joy despite hardship. Similarly, the poetry of the time began to reflect on death, loss, and the search for meaning in a world altered by catastrophe. These works often grappled with the tension between faith and doubt, hope and despair. Philosophically, the Black Death prompted renewed questioning of human existence and the nature of suffering. Medieval scholasticism, which had dominated intellectual life with its emphasis on reconciling faith and reason, was challenged by the stark realities that the plague revealed. Some thinkers began to emphasize more personal and experiential approaches to understanding life and death. The crisis highlighted the limits of human knowledge and control, fostering a sense of humility and contemplation. This intellectual shift contributed to the gradual emergence of Renaissance humanism, a movement that placed greater value on individual experience, the study of classical texts, and the exploration of human potential. Artists and scholars began to explore the natural world and human anatomy with greater precision and curiosity, partly driven by the desire to understand life more fully in the aftermath of so much death. In summary, the Black Death reshaped European arts, literature, and philosophy by bringing death and mortality to the forefront of cultural expression. It inspired new artistic motifs, profound literary works, and philosophical questioning that laid important groundwork for the Renaissance and the modern era. In the next part, we will examine how the plague influenced economic structures and the long-term effects on trade, labor, and wealth distribution. Now that we have seen how the Black Death transformed religion, culture, and thought, we turn to perhaps one of the most far-reaching consequences of the plague: its impact on the medieval economy. The devastation wrought by the plague irrevocably altered labor, trade, wealth distribution, and social structures in Europe. Before the plague, the medieval economy was primarily agrarian, centered on manorial estates worked by serfs and peasants tied to the land. Population growth had steadily increased labor supply, which in turn kept wages low and maintained a rigid feudal system. However, the Black Death dramatically reduced the population, wiping out an estimated 30 to 60% of Europeans. This sudden and severe decline in labor force created a profound scarcity of workers. With fewer peasants and laborers available, those who survived found themselves in greater demand. As a result, wages began to rise, sometimes significantly, for agricultural workers, craftsmen, and other laborers. This shift gave peasants and workers new leverage to negotiate better terms, including higher pay and improved working conditions. The traditional feudal obligations that bound peasants to the land began to erode under this pressure. Landowners, facing labor shortages, struggled to maintain their estates and harvest crops. Many tried to enforce old laws to suppress wages and bind workers to the land, but widespread unrest and revolts, such as the English Peasants' Revolt of 1381, challenged these efforts. These uprisings expressed growing dissatisfaction with social inequality and feudal oppression. Trade and commerce also underwent significant changes. With fewer people to produce goods, some industries contracted, but others adapted and grew. The increased wages and slightly more disposable income of peasants spurred demand for goods, helping markets and towns to develop. The plague accelerated urbanization as survivors moved to cities seeking better opportunities and freedom from rural obligations. Cities became vibrant centers of commerce, banking, and crafts, laying the foundation for a more diversified and dynamic economy. The devastation also caused disruptions in long-distance trade routes, initially leading to shortages and economic contraction in some regions. However, over time, European merchants sought new markets and goods, expanding trade networks to the Mediterranean, the Middle East, and beyond. The labor shortage forced innovations in agriculture and production. Landowners experimented with more efficient farming techniques and began shifting from labor-intensive crops to livestock, which required fewer workers. Additionally, the reduction in population decreased pressure on land, allowing more space and resources per capita. This, combined with rising wages, slowly improved living standards for many survivors. In the longer term, the economic upheaval contributed to the gradual breakdown of the feudal system and the rise of a more market-oriented economy. The social mobility that emerged challenged the rigid class structures of the Middle Ages, setting the stage for the Renaissance and early modern Europe. The Black Death also left a lasting legacy on attitudes toward wealth and life. Some survivors embraced new opportunities for prosperity and personal advancement, while others remained haunted by memories of loss and mortality. In conclusion, the Black Death was not only a catastrophic human tragedy, but also a catalyst for profound economic transformation. Its effects on labor, trade, and social structures reshaped medieval Europe and influenced the trajectory of Western history for centuries to come.